Good morning, rabies and germs, and welcome to the Out of Frame podcast. My name's Nicholas McConnaughay, and for our third episode, I will be sharing my thoughts on the Crash Bandicoot video game series, or at least all the series I've fully experienced and feel confident articulating my thoughts on at this very moment. This edition will include my opinion on the remastered Crash and Sane Trilogy, as well as Crash Team Racing and Crash Twinsanity. Part of why I wanted to talk about them, besides the simple fact I wanted an excuse to play more Crash video games, with them having always been a childhood favorite of mine, is I was curious if any entries outside the original Naughty Dog trilogy were worthy of receiving a similar remaster as the Insane Trilogy. Mind you, I'm aware that Crash Team Racing was also made by Naughty Dog, but the rest of the series thereafter had completely different developers involved. I've had a lot of interesting things happen to me from a life perspective as of late. In particular, I was able to attend my second Comic-Con as a vendor, selling copies of my novel The Kane's Files and Catalina the Hollow respectively, which is something I'll talk about in more depth on the eventual Halloween special edition of Out of Frame. I've also started working more thoroughly on The Kane's Files sequel. After Scott and I finished the first novel, both of us jumped headfirst into its successor immediately after, finishing the first 3 episodes quickly. But after that, both of us decided to take a hiatus from the project to finish other books we'd been working on. Specifically, I took the time to work on editing Catalina the Hollow and working on several other projects, including a horror novel and several new fantasy books I'll hopefully be able to work on later down the line. As of right now, I'm working on the 4th episode of The Adventures of Vulpecula. That's what I call my part of the Kane's Files books, and I hope to have the first finished draft of the Kane's Files 2 finished by the end of this year. Now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and jump forth into the reviewing aspect of the podcast. As I'm sure it is with other gamers, I anticipated the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy with some excitement. I loved the Crash Bandicoot series a lot as a kid, and I especially always held Crash Bandicoot 2 in high regard. Furthermore, I also enjoyed the rest of the initial series, Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure on the Game Boy Advance, as well as Twinsanity and Tag Team Racing. Like many others, I lost interest in Crash Bandicoot in my later years. Some of that can certainly be credited to the series' decline or evident loss in identity, as I recall Crash Mind Over Mutant feeling a little mundane and pedestrian when the dust settled. If I ever have the chance, I would like to go through and review some other entries in the series as well, although some entries like Crash of the Titans or Mind Over Mutants go for a pretty penny online. And considering how lackluster I anticipate them to be, I really can't justify the investment. Sometimes it takes going back to where something began in order to fully realize what worked and decide the best course for thereafter. Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy is a platform video game compilation developed by Vicarious Vision and published by Activision. Although originally perceived as a PlayStation 4 exclusive, the series can now be found on the Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, and Microsoft Windows. As already iterated, Vicarious Vision were at the helm for the remaster and certainly deserve a lot of credit in terms of its contribution to the final product. However, the games released originally, which include Crash Bandicoot, Cortex Strikes Back, and Warped, were developed by Naughty Dog for the original PlayStation back in the late 90s. This remaster has been met with considerable critical praise as well as marketability, with the series having sold over 2 million copies worldwide by 2018, creating the hope that Vicarious Vision might be able to come together for a new standalone title for the series. The story featured in the first Crash video game is simple and straightforward. It consists of Crash, a bandicoot with a high desire for jumping on boxes and spinning, stopping Dr. Neo Cortex from taking over the world. You'll traverse a series of levels, followed by occasional boss battles, all while collecting Wumpa Fruit. As far as less obvious changes, the remaster improves smaller details like the save system, adds time trials, which weren't available till the 3rd video game, allows the ability to play most levels as Crash's sister, and adds new recordings of the game's dialogue with the help of more recent voice actors for the series. The more obvious changes can certainly be seen in the graphical presentation though, because all 3 games look and sound fantastic, bringing the vibrantly colorful worlds to the modern era, equipped with a stylish and unique music that helps make it feel hard not to love the series' energy and upbeat enthusiasm. Something you might be curious to hear is that I wasn't a fan of the first Crash video game when I was a kid. As a matter of fact, I didn't like the first Crash on account of the difficulty I had maneuvering the camera angles. Difficulty is a new word I've seen thrown around when everyone talks about the trilogy, and firstly, I don't understand why this is perceived as a new revelation, and secondly, I don't think it is an entirely accurate observation. The reason I disagree with this is because from my perspective, Crash 2 and Crash 3 are very casual video games. They're straightforward and have a very average amount of challenge to them. If someone were to describe them individually, they'll be more likely to call them a good or bad video game. It's only the first Crash video game I would refer to as above the difficulty of typical platformers. and most of that has to do with its nature as a kind of almost 3D platformer, blending side-scrolling, front-scrolling, and back-scrolling, usually to very good results, but oftentimes as well with maddeningly irritating quirks. You'll find yourself constantly thinking you're jumping one way, only to find yourself spazzing out and jumping in a completely different direction than what's intended. The limited nature of your jumping can also make precision difficult to gauge. Unfortunately for the remastered Crash, a lot of the problems with that remain. I appreciate it more now that I'm older though, and what made me dislike it as a kid doesn't feel like a deal breaker anymore. The first Crash has plenty of fun moments, and although I don't feel it has the blissful playability of its successors due to what I've mentioned, I do think it's a solid mascot platformer. Some criticisms about Crash in 1996 are still relevant when they say that Crash didn't necessarily innovate. Although its presentation was smooth and notable at the time, and now with the visual overhaul, most of what you see in Crash has been seen in other earlier titles like Donkey Kong Country. Another fact is that the boss battles themselves, unlike the levels, felt very undercooked and like more could have been done with them. Crash Bandicoot is a solid platformer for its time, and a decent platformer looking back, and with Vicarious Vision's fantastic job sprucing it up to the modern era, makes a nostalgic trip for fans and a decent starting point for young gamers. And now let's go ahead and look at Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back. Crash Bandicoot 2's Cortex Strikes Back is rightfully considered, generally, as a superior game to its predecessor. The game's graphics, controls, and music have continued to improve, and more importantly, it fixed pretty much all the criticisms I had in regards to the camera angle and platforming of the first. The storyline is straightforward and stays simple, which is what I think is likely for the best with a mascot game like this, because it allows the charm to be appreciated, whereas if it were featured more robustly, I think the humor and novelty of itself would start to have its faults overexposed. In this one, Crash is abducted by Dr. Neo Cortex and is tricked into gathering crystals across various levels. Crash 2 captures a wonderful playability in nature, and while I think you could still argue a lot of the faults I mentioned earlier about the first, such as how the boss battles are easy and the gameplay itself isn't too innovative, I think it bucks off some of that stigma simply because of how much more fun and fluid it is. The visuals at the time of release for Crash 2 were considered of a high quality, and Vicarious Vision does a fantastic job of making them a high quality standard once again. I've tried to look at Crash 2 as objectively as one can with a subjective opinion. Similar to those might have grown up on Mario or Sonic, I was brought up on Crash and Spyro, and subsequently Ratchet and Sly Cooper. And so I spent a lot of time with the series. In particular, I spent a lot of time on Crash 2, because I didn't own a copy of Crash 3 as a kid. And of course, I had my faults with the original game. Crash Bandicoot 2 doesn't break the mold the way I would have liked. It isn't embroidered with groundbreaking concepts or sophisticated puzzle solving, and it does have glaring weak spots like its boss battles. However, Crash Bandicoot 2 does provide a very fun video game with humor and charm, and a seamless, rhythmic gameplay that feels very polished and very realized. I would have called it an above-average platformer before Vicarious got their hands on it, and now it has only gotten better. Let's go ahead and jump straight to Crash Bandicoot Warped. Something I hadn't expected when I bought the Sane Trilogy and began playing is I hadn't expected for Crash Bandicoot Warped to be the best entry in the series. I had definitely played some of Warped as a kid, but evidently a lot of my notions about the series' titles must have become blurry over the years. The game takes place immediately after the events of the second game, after Dr. Neo Cortex unleashes Uka Uka, his evil twin brother, who joins with Cortex and Dr. Nefarious Trophy in their effort to gather crystals that lay across time, looking to enslave Earth. Crash and friends set out to stop him. First and foremost, although the storyline itself continues to rightly take a backseat to the gameplay, it's definite that the charm of the characters is allowed to bleed through more robustly this time around. Not only that, but Warped introduces a lot of new and interesting locations for Crash to explore, alongside an inspired variation of different music to accompany us, setting the mood. Although Vicarious Vision has widely closed the gap in making the trilogy visually on par with one another, Crash Warped looked the best then, and it looks the best now, benefiting from so many unique locations for the developers to pick, whether it be from the prehistoric era with dinosaurs, or the Middle Ages with wizards and knights. The new unique settings are one thing, however what really sets Warped aside is how it beautifully blends everything established before with newly integrated ideas, making small tweaks and modifications that make all the difference in terms of making Warped step out of the shadow of some of the other platformer entries it's often compared to. The easy, overtly simple, and undercooked boss battles of the previous installments have been improved a considerable amount. Although I will admit a couple of the boss battles felt throwaway in nature, I do think Crash 3's boss battles deliver where it counts most. Crash Bandicoot Warped delivers a very good video game experience, enhanced terrifically by Vicarious Vision's remaster. The video game keeps the sheer playability of Crash 2 and improves on it. Adds more charm to the characters, and through its unique setting allows an experience that improves on its predecessors in virtually every way possible. So what I'm getting at in conclusion, as far as the Insane Trilogy is concerned, Vicarious Vision does a fantastic job at remastering the series, making them relevant again to the next generation of gamers and allowing old fans of the series a chance to experience them in a new light. Everything looks fantastic, they did a wonderful job. As far as ratings are concerned, I'm going to go ahead and say that I give Crash a 6 out of 10, Crash 2 a 7 out of 10, and Crash 3 an 8 out of 10, or in other words, I say that Crash is above average, Crash 2 is good, and Crash 3 is very good. As far as the remaster as a whole, I would say that they did a very good job. Okay, let's go ahead and jump forth. Let's go ahead and look at Crash Team Racing. Now, back when I was a kid, I used to think Crash Bandicoot was the bee's knees, his legs, and his arms, and I think the series was the pinnacle of my early years playing video games, outmatching Spyro and other PlayStation classics. Although I think the consensus from the gaming public now sees the series as a worthwhile, solid platforming series, back during its release prior to the Insane Trilogy bringing it back to the limelight, I could remember a lot of criticisms thrown at the series. A lot of comparisons were made to Donkey Kong Country, which I actually talked about earlier, with some critics saying the series lacked innovation and uniqueness, regardless of the innovation it brought as far as polygonal graphic design. I can understand the sentiment on some level, and I retained a lot of criticisms about the first installment of the Crash Bandicoot series, even if the remastered version fixed a lot of the lingering problems I had with it. Even if I might be in the minority, I still stand as one of the proud defenders of the series as far as bringing in a new vibrant mascot character. A video game in the Crash Bandicoot series that's unlikely to buck off that stigma or resentment is Crash Team Racing, a kart racing experience that most certainly takes a lot of inspiration from Konami Crazy Racers, a Game Boy Advance video game that revolutionized the kart racing genre. Joking aside, Crash Team Racing simply borrows too much to avoid comparisons and criticisms for its similarities and heavy inspiration taken from Mario Kart. Although it might be controversial to say, I much prefer Crash Team Racing to Mario Kart, and as a matter of fact, Crash's first go-around with kart racing might very well be my favorite video game in the Crash series out of them all. Some factors to keep in mind are, of course, the fact I grew up on PlayStation in the mid-90s and didn't have a Nintendo console until the GameCube years later. I've played the original Mario Kart as well as the Nintendo 64 release, but I haven't seen how the series has improved or grown since then. I spent a lot of time on Crash Team Racing for this review, making certain to appreciate every little nuance and detail. I went ahead and collected all the CTR tokens, a game mode edition that features you replaying levels, this time with the added goal of collecting the letters CTR, which are spread throughout the track. It's a simple novelty, but it adds a certain extra layer to the tracks, helping you appreciate the secrets that developer Naughty Dog incorporated. I collected all of the relics, which are collected through time trials, which are spiced up with boxes spread over the area, which allow you to slow down the clock and improve your time. Not only did I finish the initial campaign, but I collected the 6 jewels, which are collected through winning different cups with this point system straight out of Mario Kart. I feel comfortable I did everything I needed to do with Crash Team Racing, and yet, I didn't do it for any other reason than my own enjoyment. This is PlayStation, where there are no trophies or achievements, no real bragging rights, but I did it because I wanted to maximize my time with it. I think that what benefits Crash Team Racing a lot is the way it embeds gameplay elements from the original series, and is that it fully engrosses and embodies itself as a racing game. The tracks have elements heavily inspired from the level design in previous installments, with aesthetically appealing scenery that allows it to feel realized. It doesn't feel like a marketing cash-in for the series as much as it does a very seamless and natural detour. It helps that the racing is a lot of fun, with vehicles that are easy to handle, with racetracks packed with power-ups and weaponry that can afford you a chance to get out of even the tightest of binds. Every race is fast, carefree fun, benefited significantly by the subject matter, characters, and worlds it's built around. If by some chance you were brought up on Mario, then it's reasonable to think that Mario Kart was benefited considerably by its cast of characters and the familiarity of its world. This is something that impacts my opinion on Crash Team Racing, but as objectively as I can be about something as absolutely subjective as this, I think Crash Team Racing amounts to what I always yearn these types of experiences to be. As far as criticisms are concerned, I do admittedly have a few. I think the difficulty of Crash Team Racing leaves a lot to be desired. Specifically, Crash Team Racing's overt simplification oftentimes benefits it in terms of having a certain plug-and-play quality to it. I would have liked for them to include the option for heightened difficulty on levels. After you finish the initial campaign of Crash Team Racing, as I've said, it allows you the chance to participate in cup-like engagements, and it heightens the difficulty for them. Although the difficulty is still medium at best, it is a lot closer to what I would have liked to see the whole way through. Otherwise, the best way to summarize my thoughts on Crash Team Racing is to conclude that it is the best case scenario of a spin-off experience like this. Although I will lastly go on record and rate it behind Crash 3, they both received the very good rating of 8 out of 10 in my eyes. It captured what was fun and enjoyable about the original source, while at the same time succeeding on its own merit as a kart racing experience. With that said, let's go ahead and move on to Crash Twinsanity, the last review of the podcast. Over the years, I found my childhood is filled with foggy representations of the video games I might have played or the movies I might have watched. My earliest memories of Crash Bandicoot were most certainly of the original PlayStation, particularly, like I said, on Crash 2, Tag Team Racing, and then Crash Bash. Later, the PlayStation 2 platform arguably wasn't as kind to the Orange Bandicoot, but that doesn't necessarily mean the PlayStation 2 platform wasn't fruitful for the series. Crash Twinsanity and Crash Tag Team Racing were what I remembered most. Back then, maybe it was because the popularity of the series itself had waned so considerably, I was lucky enough to find Crash Nitro Kart, Crash Tag Team Racing, and Crash Twinsanity, all boxed together, priced at a very reasonable $20, and it's from that box set I review the titles today. The reason I bring up my foggy nostalgic lenses is that even though I remembered Crash Twinsanity fondly, I don't believe I ever got very far into it. This is because, in my opinion, Crash Twinsanity, or Crash 5, The Ambition of Crash and Cortex, is the most difficult of the series that I've played. When everyone was clamoring about how difficult the new Sane Trilogy was, I concurred that the first Crash video game was a considerably challenging experience, but I thought it was reasonable. And I think that Crash 2 and Crash 3 had more casual and accessible experiences. It was like night and day comparing the original game to its successors. Like apples and oranges, or apples and Wumpa fruit, I suppose. It has sharp fangs, but does Crash Twinsanity stand out as an experience worth highlighting? And is it worthy of the coveted remaster that we've been talking about so much? Something I noticed straight away while revisiting Crash Twinsanity is that it really doubles down on the humor of the series. Developed by Traveller's Tales Oxford Studios, a studio most often associated with movie adaptations and the LEGO video games, I've since found Crash Twinsanity seems to have developed a following as being the best of the Crash games not developed by Naughty Dog. Published by Vivendi Universal Games, it acts as the 11th installment in the series and happens 3 years after the events of Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex. But unlike any of the series before it, it puts Crash Bandicoot and Dr. Neo Cortex together as a cohesive unit in an effort to try and stop a duo of mutant parrots, aptly titled the Evil Twins. Going back to what I said about the humor, I really do think this one amps up the comedic aspects that had previously been featured. A lot of the environments and scenes find their worth from inflicting slapstick torment to Cortex, whether it be a beehive landing on his head, or Crash deciding Cortex is better suited as a sled. Although I would never really dub the earlier Crash games as adult-oriented by any means. I mean, sure, that they went through that edgy phase in the late 90s, and, he did that crotch chop thing. But it was always silly and easygoing. But I think this game in particular feels more like I could envision it as an early 2000s Nickelodeon cartoon. The lightheartedness and goofy charm is something I think shone through, especially with Crash Twinsanity, and it's likely what made me stick with it most as a kid. Although Twinsanity differs from the original trilogy's level system, opting for a more linear, continuous approach, it also offers exploration and various secrets to uncover. Sometimes I find myself asking whether there's too many collectibles and bonuses, and whether they were being used as a crutch for lack of more engaging content. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. The gameplay some of the time does feel like it follows the conventions of the series' formula, with some fresh ideas sprinkled in as well. I appreciate the developers for wanting to try something new instead of recycling what had already been treaded. It's very gimmicky in its execution, and I think that it successfully coasts on novelty on occasion. For instance, it has some sequences where Crash and Cortex roll around with each other in a cartoon fist fight, allowing you to move around with them as if they were a ball. And I think if I look past the charm of that, if I look past the gimmicky novelty and, it's just kind of funny to see him rolling around, the controls and movements were very awkward and clunky in those moments. I encountered my fair share of glitches while I played Crash Twinsanity, and although I would sometimes overlook certain issues like this, I thought they were present enough to be worth mentioning. It goes back to what I said at the start of the review regarding Crash Twinsanity's difficulty. But I had moments where I would trigger cutscenes, and once that cutscene ended, I would immediately be attacked by like a rat or something crawling around in the area, resulting in my death. The camera angle can be difficult for approximating the distance away from something or calculating a jump properly, but can also be downright damning, making it aggravating to try and look around with it constantly jerking you back to its wanted perspective. The music is something I went back and forth on. In the beginning stages, I thought the music was grating and repetitive, offering a generic loop that may not have been so bad at first, but became more overbearing the more I had to listen to it. Thereafter, however, I thought that the music started to develop more of a unique identity in preceding levels, offering a sound consistent with the gameplay and the tone of the characters. If I had a choice, though, I would prefer a more upbeat jungle sound akin to what we had in the original series. It just feels like this one was just kind of background music, whereas the original series, the music had more of a pulse, I guess is what I would say. What makes Crash Twinsanity so difficult is actually one of my biggest criticisms about it. When I say it's difficult, I should elaborate in saying that no singular task is exceptionally difficult. As a matter of fact, in the early going, I found myself thinking Crash Twinsanity would be the easiest of the series, synchronizing with its more childish, casual aesthetic and tone. What I found made it difficult, however, is how long some of the levels were, and how, if you lost all of your lives at any point, you had to start at the beginning of that level. Okay, so imagine having a sequence of platforming, areas where it's very easy to make a simple mistake that costs you a life. Follow that with a boss battle that, aside from how easy it is to die because the spikes on the platform you're fighting on is casual, then a chase scene where a burly person is chasing after you. In the early Crash games, this burly person would have been replaced by, like a large rock. You remember those Indiana Jones chasing scenes. Then after that, follow it up with a second boss battle. If you lose your lives in this sequence of time, you have to restart the entire level over again. Nothing about the challenges themselves are inherently difficult, and so it is an artificially inflated difficulty, which, compounded with the bad camera angles, results in what feels like very cheap, time-consuming deaths. Upon inspection, Crash Twinsanity isn't terrible, but it is my least favorite of the series I've reviewed thus far, at least if we're substituting the PlayStation 1 classics with the newly remastered Sane Trilogy, because then I might consider it above the first PS1 Crash game. As of this standing though, I think it's only an average video game and platformer, and honestly I'm a little disappointed that I didn't like it more than what I did. As far as ratings are concerned for this game, I'm going to go ahead and give it a 5 out of 10, which would be the lowest of the series so far. That said, that's really all I have to talk about on this edition of the Out of Frame podcast. The next episode will be the Halloween edition, which I will talk more about the Saluki Comic Con that I attended, including information about the Kane's Files, and I'll have a lot of big movies I'm going to look at. I want to look at the new Nun movie, and I also want to go ahead and look at Goosebumps Haunted Halloween. Thanks for joining me this morning on the Out of Frame podcast. This has been episode 3, and I'll see you again with episode 4, which will be posted on Halloween. My name's Nicholas McConaughey, and I'll see you next time.